a call to navigate the future together at a meeting of Southeast Asian nations. On the agenda, Myanmar and regional security. But officials are gathering as the US-Iran war escalates. Will the conflict overshadow other issues facing ASEAN? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. No country can go it alone. That's the declaration from the Philippines, which is hosting a meeting of foreign ministers from Southeast Asia. They're expected to address regional security issues, including the civil war in Myanmar and the territorial dispute in the South China Sea. But renewed fighting between the US and Iran has overshadowed the gathering. Ministers have called for hostilities to end. The conflict has hit Asia hard, disrupting its energy and food supplies, international commerce, and raising fears of a global economic slowdown. Will it also affect ASEAN's efforts to tackle issues within the region? In a moment, we'll discuss these issues with our guests. But now this report from Amabotang.
As foreign ministers from Southeast Asia meet in the Philippines, they're watching closely what's happening in the Middle East. Member states depend on Gulf countries for their oil imports. They've been severely affected by the disruptions to trade and energy supplies caused by the conflict between the US and Iran, and they're trying to find ways to reduce the impact.
Cooperation is no longer a choice. It is a strategic necessity. In a fractured global landscape, no single nation can weather these storms alone. Our strength and resilience lie in our community. Acting together, it is our shield against external pressures and our engine for regional stability.
Washington's top diplomat was also at the meeting. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the US wants to strengthen its relationship with the bloc. He said the Trump administration was still willing to pursue diplomacy to end the war, but that Washington would defend freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz.
What is at stake here is not simply the issue of what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz. It's a very fundamental principle about freedom of navigation. And if that is threatened, then I think the global economy is threatened, and the rules which have underpinned 150 years of international trade and commerce are also threatened.
In waters closer to home, ASEAN countries face another challenge: tensions surrounding the South China Sea, a vital global trade route. There was a flare-up on Monday, a confrontation between Philippine and Chinese sailors. Manila says members of Beijing's Coast Guard injured their sailors, while China says a Philippine boat rammed one of their patrol vessels. Several ASEAN member states have made territorial claims to the South China Sea in a long-running dispute with Beijing. Within the bloc, there's been little progress made towards ending the civil war in Myanmar. Its military leaders have been barred from attending ASEAN meetings since the coup in 2021 overthrew the democratically elected government. Last week, the group held informal talks with Myanmar's foreign minister. They renewed calls for an end to the fighting, which has killed at least 100,000 people. But rights groups criticized the move, calling it a reward for Myanmar's generals, without securing any concessions. Despite those regional challenges, this year's ASEAN meeting appears to be overshadowed by events in the Middle East, as governments try to find ways to combat the effects of the US-Iran war at home. Amma Boateng, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's discuss all of this and bring in today's panel of guests. And in Manila, we have Richard Heydarian, a political scientist and author of Indo-Pacific, Trump, China and the New Struggle for Global Mastery. Joining us from Kuala Lumpur, Phar Kim Ben, Professor in ASEAN Studies at the International Islamic University of Malaysia and former Director of Political and Security Community at the ASEAN Secretariat. And also in Manila, Don McLean Gill, lecturer at the De La Salle University and Indo-Pacific Research Fellow with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today on Inside Story, so we can look at all of the issues that are being discussed and that matter in your region. The interesting thing to me, Richard, is that actually with with a few little exceptions, most of the issues that are buffeting your region are things that are coming from outside the region.
Well, absolutely, especially the host country, the chairman of the ASEAN this year. The Philippines has been one of the worst affected countries by the crisis in the Hormuz. And of course, for us Filipinos, it's not only the energy shock, which has severely affected the Philippine economy. The GDP growth in the country in the first quarter was one of the lowest in recent memory since the pandemic period. But also for the Philippines, we have direct interest because millions of Filipinos actually live in the Gulf region. And they are also directly affected, both in terms of their employment security, if not their own personal security. So I think the Philippines was, in a way, unfortunately, the perfect country to host ASEAN this year, precisely because of its own direct interest.
Phar, what about where you are in Kuala Lumpur? Is Malaysia also suffering right now economically because of what's going on, not where you are, but pretty much where I am?
Malaysia is doing well for some reason, one of which is because Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, has a rather strong team when it comes to addressing the economic implications and impact emerging or manifesting from the war or the lockdown in the Strait of Hormuz and now the Red Sea. So he's actually assisted by one of the most capable economic lieutenants in Malaysia, and that person is none other than the former chief executive officer of Petronas, one of the largest oil trading company in the world. So in that sense, Prime Minister Anwar or Malaysian government is capable of handling whatever that is actually coming out of that region.
Don, tell us, so we've heard that Philippines is badly affected by the current situation. Which other countries would you say across the ASEAN bloc are suffering most?
Well, this is not to say that one is suffering more than the others. In fact, this is a collective problem, and energy security or energy insecurity would likely take center stage in this meeting as well. This is reminiscent of the May ASEAN leaders meet in Cebu City, where energy security and the crisis in the Middle East was at the heart of the deliberations among ASEAN officials. The crisis has left ASEAN members scrambling, all of them, for options to secure their energy interests. And like my co-panelist from Malaysia has rightfully said, ASEAN member countries have been able to temporarily weather the crisis through short-term measures, diversification, reducing reliance on individual sources, but there is no quick fix. There are some collective initiatives, such as the ASEAN Petroleum Security Agreement of energy sharing, but when it comes to hurdles such as the storage, the processes, and of course sharing energy, that becomes equally difficult for ASEAN countries. I think the only way forward would be speeding up the transition to renewables, and that's not an easy feat.
We keep talking about ASEAN, so let's, before we continue, just tell our viewers a little bit more about ASEAN, which is nearly 60 years old. It's made up of 11 countries in Southeast Asia. Their aim is to work together to help grow their economies, maintain peace and solve problems. ASEAN member states are home to nearly 680 million people. Their combined economy is valued at $3.9 trillion, making it the fifth largest globally. The ASEAN region plays a crucial role in food production, with member countries exporting around half of the world's rice. Richard, that's why ASEAN is so important. And what is interesting to me, yes, this is a foreign ministers' meeting of your region. And as we say, there are issues all around the world affecting your region, but there are also visitors from all around the world. It's interesting who the guest list is for this.
I mean, without the question, if you look at the ASEAN, it's one of the most successful cases of regional integration outside the European Union. And if you look at Southeast Asia, the roots of the ASEAN were really in the thick of the Cold War. You're talking about the Indochina War, you're talking about the Korean War. And one of the biggest successes of the ASEAN over the past half a century or so is that, at the very least, you don't have open conflict, with some exceptions here and there, including the border clashes between Thailand and Cambodia more recently. But overall, the era of confrontasy, the era of all-out war, the era of massive, potentially violent territorial disputes among ASEAN countries have more or less been contained, right? And I think this is one of the biggest achievements of ASEAN. And more importantly, the ASEAN has been moving towards greater economic integration, not to mention energy security integration. One of the proposals is for the region to have its own grid, regional grid, so that we can share our resources. And then if ever some of the members are facing a more acute energy security crisis, it could be helped by the rest of the region. So in that sense, the ASEAN has come so far. Nevertheless, I think when it comes to the expectation of how far the ASEAN could have gone, when it comes to dealing with some of the problems within ASEAN countries, we're going to discuss some of them, like the Myanmar crisis. And more importantly, when it comes to dealing with major powers, I think the ASEAN has come short, because whether it's China, whether it's the United States, the reality is that there's no ASEAN policy. There are ASEAN countries, national policies towards these countries. But at the very least, what ASEAN provides is a platform, a safe space for all of these major powers to come together and for ASEAN countries individually to deal with them. But we see at once a lot of, successes throughout the decades, but we're also seeing the limitations of that in terms of constraining the worst behavior of the superpowers.
And Phar, you used to work at the ASEAN Secretariat. Is the reason there's not an ASEAN policy because of the way ASEAN works? It's a consensus organisation. We hear talk about the Asian quiet diplomacy. Is that both its strength and its weakness?
When it comes to ASEAN, obviously, over the last 60 years, it has evolved a very distinctive manner of making decisions and actually conducting the diplomatic processes. And there are also very unique terminology that can only be understood by ASEAN. So, for instance, a lot of people assume that ASEAN is strictly based on what is known as the diplomacy of non-intervention. But then you have to qualify that in the sense that it's actually operated by two basic principles. One, no member state shall covertly or openly criticize the military alliance of another fellow member state. And in tandem to that is actually the second principle. No member state shall covertly or openly support the opposition movement of another member state. When you combine the operating principle of these two, then you have a region that is relatively stable, to the degree that the two values continue to function as the key diplomatic mechanism or platform. Then you will not see any serious conflicts that can actually affect the capitals, with very rare exceptions, such as the conflict that you saw between Thailand and Cambodia. But that only affected the border and was modified or even resolved or managed by both ASEAN and the intervention of President Donald Trump when he was in ASEAN in the capacity of the leader of the United States in East Asian Summit, which is also another parallel mechanism that comes together with ASEAN.
When we talk about that guest list, Don, it is interesting in a world which is dividing into blocks, that at the ASEAN summit you have the EU, you have the Russians, you also have the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio present at this meeting. I mean, that is a difficult balancing act, is it not, for ASEAN, where it stands with regard to the US and China?
Yes, absolutely. And if you look at history, if you look at the political history, since the birth of ASEAN in 1967, I don't think that there could be any other institution that could serve as an alternative to ASEAN, particularly because of these ASEAN-led mechanisms that allow a wide array of actors come in, discuss, negotiate, deliberate on various issues across the world. And this is something that also leads to a limited problem for ASEAN, is because there is unlikely going to be another ASEAN or an ASEAN 2.0. There are also challenges when it comes to complacency of how effective ASEAN members can be in getting their acts together, particularly in having a bigger say about what is taking place within their immediate neighborhood. But then again, going back to the guest list, this is remarkable. In fact, this represents the successful diplomacy of ASEAN and how ASEAN countries, if you look at various players across the world, you look at various Indo-Pacific strategies of European states or within the region itself, all of them seem to be pledging allegiance to ASEAN and ASEAN centrality. And that, of course, represents the significance that ASEAN holds in their respective foreign policy decision-making. However, the other side of the story here is that whether ASEAN has the capacity to leverage this significance to more directly and more proactively shape the agenda. Now, that's a story for another day.
Richard, I mean, with regard to the US, they started a war that's causing all this economic turmoil. You also had the Trump tariffs last year, which largely struck down by the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, but that seems to be possibly raising its head again in the coming months. And yet, on the other side, you have problems with China, particularly the South China Sea. And we saw in our report that those clashes with the Philippines and China just at the very start of this summit. Where's public opinion on all of this? Is it more favourable to China or the US right now?
I mean, we saw the Pew Research Center just recently released a survey whereby it shows that I think for the first time in recent memory, China is more popular than the United States globally. And we can see that in a lot of key countries, core countries in Southeast Asia. I would say my country, Philippines, is a little bit more exceptional, whereby it is generally more positive towards the United States than many of its neighbors because of historical reasons.
Because it used to be a US colony.
But the reality is that colony, of course, which the Americans, by the way, do not officially recognize, unlike the Spanish. But the fact of the matter is that despite that diversity, the de facto principle is hedging. In fact, what you see across Southeast Asia is 50 shades of hedging, right? Each country tries to hedge between the United States and China in different ways because we don't want to choose. And we know that when we chose sides during the Cold War period, during the Vietnam War, it was extremely devastating for us. And in the 21st century, you want to make the most out of your relationship with both sides, with both China, which is a top trading partner, and the United States, which is a major source of investment, not only a security partner for countries like Thailand and the Philippines. But the reality is that the Trump administration is putting more and more pressure on regional states to choose a side. And in fact, ASEAN always talks about middle power diplomacy. And you hear from top officials in the US like Elbridge Colby that, this middle power is not going to work because you have to choose between the two of us. When it comes to China, I think they have been much more nuanced because perhaps they feel time is on their side, geography is on their side, and they feel that America's influence in the region is more a geopolitical accident because of its victory in the Second World War. But I don't see any indication that the US wants to withdraw from this part of the world, even though many see it as still bogged down with the conflicts in the Middle East and perhaps for the foreseeable future. So that's the tension. That's the difficulty that we're facing in Southeast Asia. And lastly, as the Singaporeans put it, we're watching what's happening in the Hormuz Strait very carefully because our worry is that this could be a dry run for what could happen in the Malacca Strait, which is even more important for the global economy and could directly involve not one but two superpowers. So that's why in Southeast Asia, we're very worried. But whether we have a collective response to that, unfortunately, I'm still not seeing it because ASEAN is a supranational organization, not a unified organization with a singular defense and foreign policy.
Phar, as Richard says there, the issues of maritime law and rights of navigation have been the focus in recent months in the Middle East. But they are issues that come up in your region regarding ASEAN and China. There have been efforts to try and regulate this for 30 years there's been a plan for a code of conduct. It's never been finally agreed, a final version of that. How much of a problem is this going forward?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that when it comes to territorial or even maritime conflict, it is actually more reasonable to expect two sides trying to solve the issue rather than a multilateral organization such as ASEAN trying to weigh in on every aspect of the issue. Not only does it complicate the solution, but it actually entraps everyone into the whole process, because the nature of each other's claim vis-a-vis China is entirely different. So we have to accept that the way forward for each and every claimant state in South China Sea is actually very bilateral in nature. However, that is not how the conventional literature of international relations actually presented. In other words, whenever they try to explain how China and the respective claimant states should resolve the issue, the pairing is usually ASEAN and China. That may look good in terms of presentation or optic, but in reality, it boils down to how two sides, in other words, in the case of Malaysia and China, eventually come to a modus vivendi or even a final solution at some stage.
Okay.
But
Phar, I need to interrupt you there, but because before we end the programme, I need to deal with the one big problem that is in ASEAN's own neighbourhood, and that's Asia's deadliest active conflict in Myanmar. Richard, it seems, tell me if I'm wrong, that ASEAN is beginning again to normalise the junta in Myanmar. Isn't that going to be very, very difficult for ASEAN if, in the coming months, the International Court of Justice, and its ruling soon, decides that there's been a genocide in that country?
I mean, without a question, the ongoing tragedy in Myanmar has been the gushing wound to us in Southeast Asia. Perhaps it's analogous to what the Israeli-Palestine conflict means to much of the Middle East. It has been one humanitarian crisis after another throughout the past decade. And this is where also you see the other limit. So one limit when it comes to ASEAN is that it doesn't have a collective response when it comes to dealing with bullying, right, by superpowers or pressure by superpowers. It looks like everyone wants to cut their own deals with the superpowers. The other one is this principle of non-interference. This is where we could see that it's almost a curse. Because of our obstinate commitment to that principle of non-interference, it actually deprives the ASEAN from coming with a robust response to the unfolding tragedy that we have in Myanmar. So that has effectively gave the momentum, right? It has given the initiative to the most brutal and more effective element. And unfortunately, as far as the civil war in Myanmar is concerned, it looks like the junta is regaining momentum. And even if it's facing diplomatic isolation, by the way, it was supposed to be Myanmar who was supposed to be chairman of ASEAN this year, but the Philippines took over temporarily. But despite that kind of diplomatic isolation, the reality on the ground is that the junta is regaining momentum. So now ASEAN has been reduced to basically negotiating tactical concessions like access to Aung San Suu Kyi, freeing of some of the prisoners. But in terms of effectively and strategically pushing the junta towards embracing or re-embracing the constitutional democratic process, which ASEAN very wholeheartedly and tortuously shepherded in the previous decade, I still don't see a lot of bright spot over the horizon. And in my opinion, it's not only gushing wound for the region from a humanitarian aspect, but it's also one of the biggest reminders of the limits of the current ASEAN mechanism.
Phar, we heard Richard there mention Aung San Suu Kyi, the Myanmar leader who was ousted in the coup, imprisoned. Now her son has been touring the world asking for proof of life, suggestion she might even be dead. Does this not show that ASEAN's, even though it works in some places, its policy of consensus in other cases maybe even makes it complicit?
When it comes to Myanmar, we have to produce a different kind of parameter. I'm not saying this in an apologetic manner, but it is what it is. In other words, for instance, when we want to deal with President Min Aung Hlaing, who who is a very recalcitrant and stubborn person, we have to understand that he can only give this much on that particular period. So, for instance, if the likes of Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim were to meet him in Bangkok, for instance, then the most basic concession that Malaysian government can actually extract from Myanmar is the willingness of the military junta to actually allow and facilitate humanitarian aid to come in on a week-to-week basis. So as tortuous as that may sound, that unfortunately is how Myanmar works. That having been said, I'm also getting insider account from reliable journalists who are well connected to both the Prime Minister's office in Thailand, that they are making progress on Myanmar. In other words, it's not completely a black hole. As and when you press the right buttons, you can actually reach out to the new foreign minister, Tun, and also the president himself, Min Aung Hlaing, to have proof of life of Aung San Suu Kyi, but also get other concessions from the military junta.
But I mean, you mentioned the new president. He was the military leader, and no one thinks it was a particularly fair election, Richard. Finally, from you briefly, I mean, even though it's a consensus organisation, behind the scenes, are there big differences on what to do about Myanmar?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for instance, on the Rohingya crisis, because of the Muslim solidarity connection and because many of Rohingya wanted to go to places like Malaysia, clearly Malaysia was more proactive on the issue of dealing with this. At the same time, there are some countries like, for instance, Singapore that has very strong investment and strategic footprint in Myanmar and gives them the kind of leverage that many other ASEAN countries don't have. And then in the case of Thailand, obviously, because they were themselves led by a junta for a long time, they actually had friendly relationship with the junta there. So again, you don't see a clear ASEAN policy. What ASEAN perhaps realistically could do is to nudge the superpowers. I mean, China has immense influence over what happens there. Russia has a lot of influence over what happens there because it gives weapon systems to the junta. The Indians, by the way, also have a lot of influence over what happens in Myanmar. Perhaps in that capacity, ASEAN can work with the superpowers to find some sort of a common ground, which at least nudges the junta towards the least bad really option as far as the gushing wound of the humanitarian crisis there is concerned.
Richard, thank you very much, and thank you to all of our guests today on Inside Story. Richard Heydarian, Phar Kim Ben and Don McLean Gill. And thank you too for watching. If you missed any of our programme, remember you can always watch it again at any time at aljazeera.com. What do you think we should discuss next time? Go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or get in touch on X. Just look for @AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and the team here, that's where we leave it now. But please stay with Al Jazeera. Our coverage continues in a moment.